Well, good morning, Doxology. Great to see you guys. I'm Chris. I'm one of the pastors here, and it is great to have you all here today, second week of the new year, and it's great to have you. So grab a Bible if you got one handy and start making your way to Mark chapter 2 today. Mark chapter 2, and if you need a Bible, grab one of these and go to page 683. Page 683 is where I'll be today. I'll meet you there in just a second. We're in week 2, Mark chapter 2, week 2 of a series that we've called The Soul Can't Hustle. And here's the idea. Most of us are living an external life that our internal world can't keep up with. And it's killing us. Some cases, literally. We find ourselves exhausted, terrified, angry, worn out, burned out, lonely. We're terrified of what will happen if we slow down. We're also terrified of what will happen if we don't. So here we are. In fact, there's a Korean philosopher. He wrote a book called The Burnout Society. His name's Byung-Chul Han, and he observed this. He said, people in the Western world are too alive to die and way too dead to live. That sounds terrifying and familiar for a lot of us. So for 4 weeks, we're asking ourselves, what if there's another way? We're talking about 4 ancient paths, habits in the life of Jesus that it turns out may not just be ancient, they may be more relevant and more necessary than they've ever been before. And today I want to talk to you about a blessing that may be the greatest blessing you ever have to force yourself to enjoy. If you've been around Doxology for a while, you've heard me talk numerous times before about my mother-in-law's chocolate cake. So if you're a guest this morning, hey, welcome. If you haven't been around for a while, you haven't heard, my mother-in-law makes the best chocolate cake on the entire face of the planet. And that's indisputable in my mind, at least. And in fact, I always say that. Every time I say that, somebody comes up and says after the service, hey, with respect to your mother-in-law, you haven't tried mine. Fair. But sometimes even people like in an extraordinary, generous act, bring me a slice of their chocolate cake sometime during the week, okay? That is an extremely generous way for you to get your pastor to lie to your face. Okay, and I will, right? I'll look you in the eye and I will say, man, it's pretty close. It's not close. Okay, her chocolate cake, you just gotta trust me on this, take my word, it is that good. So, and everybody in our family agrees with this. So every year, any birthday that we have in our family, everybody gets Susie's chocolate cake, from the youngest to the oldest. Kason, my oldest son, for his very first birthday, she made him a little personal-sized portion of chocolate cake. That was his birthday cake at his Millie's house. So she makes it, she puts the candle in it, we sing the song, places it in front of him. You've been a part of this moment, the first birthday party. She places it in front of him, the song's over. I'm ready for my son to experience the greatest blessing of his life. She places it in front of him, the song's over, and he gags. If he didn't look exactly like me, I'd wonder if he was my kid, right? So he gets it in front of him, and I just realized, this is my son. This is my only son whom I love. I want him to receive this blessing. So I take my finger, put a little bit of it in the chocolate cake, the icing, and I put it up to his mouth, and he recoils, and he gags again. So I get a spoon. I dip the spoon into the chocolate cake, and I do the little airplane thing, that you do with 1-year-olds. That always works with my kids. And he starts flailing his arms and recoiling in his chair and screaming and yelling. He's not having the chocolate cake. So being a great dad, I didn't want to force him. So I just pulled the spoon away. And as I pulled the spoon away, just a little bit of the icing got on his lips. Kind of licked his lips. Gets this look on his face like, all right, Dad, I might be willing to try this one more time. And so I get a little more chocolate cake on the spoon and I hold it close to his mouth and he lurches towards the chocolate cake. Gets a little more taste of it in his mouth and you know what happens next, right? I wish I had video of this. I've looked and looked and looked and I can't believe I don't, but I don't seem to have video of this. It's fistfuls of chocolate cake he's grabbing and shoving at his face. He doesn't even care if it gets in his mouth. Just close is fine enough with him. It was the greatest blessing of his life he'd ever had to be forced to enjoy. Listen, I got one of those for you this morning. It's an ancient rhythm called Sabbath. Sabbath. It's the art of every single week taking a day off. Now, even in just saying that, I realize there are a couple of things about that word and that idea and this thing that I'm going to present to you that are going to cause a couple of you to gag on it just a little bit. Okay? Some of you hear the word Sabbath and you just sort of recoil from it because that's a word that defined something that your whole life growing up defined all of the rules and the regulations around the day that you hated most all throughout the week. Because Sabbath for you was a day where you weren't allowed to do any of the things that you really wanted to do. You weren't allowed to play sports on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to go to the movies. You weren't allowed to go over to your friend's house. You weren't allowed to eat out. You weren't allowed to do a lot of stuff except sit in the family room, talk about Jesus, and pretend to like it because it's Sabbath. And we remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And if that's your background with Sabbath, come on, I don't blame you for gagging. I don't think that's the intent of the gift God gave to humanity when he gave us this blessing. We'll get there in just a second. Some of you gag because that's what you think of when you think about Sabbath. Some of you gag on the whole idea of a day off because you feel like it's something that's totally impractical for somebody like you. Like rest is a luxury for the rich, and you're not rich. Like you got bills to pay. You got to make ends meet that don't currently meet. And if you take a day off, they won't meet because the competition doesn't take a day off. Your clients don't take a day off. Your boss didn't take a day off. So you can't afford to rest. Rest is a reward that you only get when you get where you're going, and you're not there yet. So you can't rest. The whole idea feels really impractical for somebody like you, okay? Be patient. I got great news for all of you. First, let's just talk about what the idea of Sabbath means, okay? Sabbath, it just means to stop, or to pause, or to rest. One time in the Old Testament, it's translated, the word Shabbat, it's translated to celebrate. That's the idea. We'll talk about it in a minute, but it's a rhythm that God invited people, not just his people, not just religious people, not just rich people, people, to live into every single week, where one day a week you push pause, you stop, you rest, you celebrate. After he gave the gift, in fact, 70 chapters in the Bible after he gives the gift, you realize God actually made it a command. He made it a rule, one of the top 10 rules. Okay, how much do you have to love a God who forces people to take a day off every week? Like, how much do you have to love a God that forces people to take, when you add it all up, 7 weeks of vacation every single year? But religious people, after God made the command, did what religious people tend to do with commands. They started to figure out how thinly it needed to be sliced. All of the rules and the regulations, and they did it, I'm sure, out of really good reasons. They didn't want to get out of bounds. They didn't want to do it wrong. And so they just started to slice it really thin and add rules and regulations to keep them from breaking the rule and regulation. And they turned it from something that was an extravagant gift into a day that made everybody gag. Enter the person of Jesus. Remember from last week, Jesus is fully God and fully human, which means that Jesus shows us what it looks like to live fully alive. He shows us what it looks like to be fully human, which often stands in contrast from the fractured, fragmented, less than human lives that we're accustomed to. And we find Jesus in Mark chapter 2. He's gone on a walk with his followers on the Sabbath, and the religious people are watching. And Jesus and his followers step in it on the Sabbath with the religious leaders. They're walking through a grain field, and the followers of Jesus reach over and pick the little heads of grain and eat some kernels of wheat as a snack. The religious leaders stop them and say, "You're picking grain. You're harvesting, technically, on the Sabbath. That's against the rules. We gotcha." And Jesus responds, Mark chapter 2, with a story from the Old Testament reminds these religious leaders that God never intended his blessings to be straitjackets on people. Then he goes on to give 2 sentences that frame his perspective on Sabbath that I think are worth paying attention to for people like us in a hustle society with souls. They can't hustle with the rest of us. Look what he says. Mark chapter 2, verses 27 and 28. Jesus is responding to the religious leaders, and it says this, Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Can you notice what Jesus doesn't say, at least right off the bat? Jesus doesn't say, the Sabbath was made for some man. He doesn't say it was made for religious man. Doesn't say it was made for Jewish man, Christian man, religious man, rich man. He just says the Sabbath was made for people. He also doesn't say, forget about the Sabbath. I mean, it's really not that big a deal to me. And in fact, I'm getting ready to die on a cross and remove the curse of the whole thing, fulfill the law, so you're not going to have to worry about it anymore. He doesn't say that. The Sabbath was made for man. Now, understand, especially if you're kind of a religious scholar and you love to look at all of these things, Jesus didn't abolish the principle when he fulfilled the law. That's really important. Jesus fulfilled the law. God gave all 613 commands. Jesus kept every single one of them letter perfect. He passed the exam with flying colors, got all of them right and all of the extra credit, and he offers for his grade to apply to us. That's incredible news. Not only that, he took our curse from failing God's exam. He hung on a cross for us. And the most incredible news possible, Jesus didn't remove the blessing when he took away the curse. Think about what this means when it comes to Sabbath. In Christ, you're free to receive the blessing of Sabbath without fear that you're somehow going to screw it up and make God mad. Somehow you're going to do it wrong and tick God off in the process. The pressure's off in Christ. The guilt's gone in Christ. But the gift is absolutely there for the taking for any of us who will receive it in Christ. Look again what Jesus affirms. Verse 27. He says, the Sabbath was made for man. It's a gift that God designed for mankind to receive. He's referring all the way back to the very beginning. Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. God creates the earth and the light and the dark and the fish and the birds and the animals, the crowning jewel, mankind in his image. And then Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3 says, by the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. And the God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from the work of creating that he'd done. Okay, here's the question. Why did God rest? Notice God goes first. Why did he do it? Well, here's what you do know. He didn't rest because he was tired. God doesn't get tired. He didn't rest because he was burned out. He didn't rest because he just needed a little me time. He didn't rest because he needed a day to practice his religion. It's not why God set this in motion. The whole chapter, Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the way that's written, it assumes that all 7 days are sacred days, created by a good God with a purpose to be lived towards every single day, not just one of them. So what's happening here in Genesis chapter 2? Why even count this day? Why doesn't it just say, God created the earth, he created it in 6 days, and that was it, end of the week? Why name the seventh day? Why call it out? Why set it apart? Why do we need the emphasis that God took a day to rest, literally to pause, or to stop, or to celebrate? I think there are a couple of things in play here. First thing I think God's doing is setting a rhythm for his creation. You can think of it as the factory defaults of the Creator. He's saying, this is how life is best lived in the creation that I've made. He's saying and he's showing the way the creation works best, to rest 6 days and stop for a day. But the second thing I think God is doing is making a declaration. Right at the very beginning, I think God is declaring right from the outset that producing and performing and accumulating and possessing and advancing and achieving are not the ultimate destination of creation. They're not the primary place that we find God's blessing or prove God's blessing or receive God's blessing or measure God's blessing in the world. God's best is not always more. Actually, two words that get used for rest, always in reference to the Sabbath. The first one we've already talked about, it's the word Shabbat. It simply means to stop producing. The other one's the Hebrew word nuach. You can practice it, it's fun to say. Just don't aim at your neighbor when you say it. Nuach. Nuach's the idea of settling in. It's the idea of sitting down by a fire, nestling into a hammock. I heard one person say this week, it's sort of like unpacking your bag at grandma's on the very first day of Christmas vacation. It's the idea of settling in, nuach. It's not primarily about what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. It's about what your God says you are free to do for 24 hours every single week. Right at the very beginning, God establishes a rhythm. Sabbath was made for man. And he sets the example so that at the end of every week, his people, the people who know him and trust him, would be able to experience an island of get to in an ocean of have to. The Sabbath wasn't designed to be a day of restrictions. It's designed to be a day that restricts your constrictions. A day where we're free to stop, to settle in, to settle down, and to actively resist everything that's been holding us down and holding us back for the first 6 days of the week. But it's actually bigger than that too. You ever heard of keystone habits? You've read the book, The Power of Habits, Charles Duhigg. I think he's the one that coined the phrase in his book. It's called The Power of Habit. A keystone habit is one habit that if you do it, it sort of makes a whole lot of other habits follow along. It's this domino effect of habits that can happen in your life. It just spills over and unintentionally creates other things that are good things to follow along with it just by doing one thing. So a couple of examples he gives is exercise. People that exercise, just one habit. When you bake that into your routine, they tend to eat better. They tend to have more energy. They tend to sleep better. Tend to make clearer, better choices in their life. All kinds of different habits that follow just the one habit of exercising. There's a whole book right now about the power of making your bed. People that make their bed in the morning tend to find lots of other habits filtering out through the whole rest of their life as a result. It's a keystone habit. It comes from this idea of a keystone in architecture, which is the piece that in an arch sits right in the very top center of the arch. It's what helps hold all of the other pieces in place. Here's the thing about the keystone. If you remove the keystone, the rest of the arch collapses. But the keystone, by its virtue, its design, it's the stone that bears the least weight of all of the other stones. The keystone. That's exactly how God has designed Sabbath to function in your life and in my life. Not just for your calendar, but for your soul. In fact, think about the 10 Commandments. Most of you know this is one of the 10 Commandments. Number 4, God calls his people to him there at the base of Mount Sinai. He declares that they're his people, and he gives them a guide through which they'll experience his blessing. Gives them 10 commands to start, how to live into his purpose and experience his blessing in the land that he's promised. The first 3 commands that he gives them are about how to love God. More specifically, how not to love God. Don't have other gods other than God. Don't try to make God into a thing that has boundaries. Don't fashion an image of God. Your God's not like that. The first 3 commands all about how to love God. The second 6 commands are all about how to love your neighbor or how not to love your neighbor. Don't steal from your neighbor. Don't murder your neighbor. Don't go after your neighbor's wife. Have one wife for you. Love God on one side. Love your neighbor on the other side. Guess what's right in the middle of the commands? Of all 10 commands, command about Sabbath is the only positive command. All of the other commands are thou shalt not. Sabbath is the only thou shalt. Not only that, Of all of the 10 commands, this is the one that gets the most detail. 30% of the words in the 10 commandments are given to Sabbath. You got to ask yourself, why? Why would that be? If you were delineating the guidelines for people, you were talking about the 10 most important things, is that the one that you would care the most about, talk the most about if you were God? Why does God drill down so much on that? Because he knew that this habit is a keystone habit for all of the other things that he commands. See, when you do this, when you do it well, you're far less likely to add a whole bunch of gods to God. Because more you live under a God who blesses, the God who blesses in a way like this, then you start to look around at all the other gods that you could serve and you realize that their command and their demand for you is always you give your life to me. And God says, hey, I'll give life to you. All of the other gods say, do more, try harder, work faster. And your God says, take a day off every week. Rest. Nestle in. I got it. I'll take care of you. Just trust me. Like, how do you not love a God like that? Why would you serve another God when you got a God like that? It's all powerful and all knowing. It's true of loving others as well. God's perspective is that you cannot and will not love your neighbor if you work too hard. We kind of know this. In fact, Walter Brueggemann has this fascinating paragraph. He has a book that's called Sabbath as Resistance. He talks about how through the book of Leviticus, if you ever read through the book of Leviticus, you realize if somebody refuses to observe the Sabbath, they're supposed to be cut off from the community, which feels really harsh, doesn't it, when you read through it? Here's what he says. He said, when you read it, it sounds awfully harsh, but the truth is a person who can't rest can't love, will ultimately destroy all of the people around them, one way or the other. They'll destroy their neighbor, destroy their marriage. They'll be physically or emotionally absent from their children. They'll take moral shortcuts to get what they want because they refuse to wait or rest. They won't have any margin to see or meet the needs of the people around them. So people who can't rest become like a cancer to community. I think he's onto something. Notice how many of Jesus' miracles are done on the Sabbath? I don't think that's an accident. And I also don't think it's just because Jesus loved to stick it to the Pharisees. Jesus loved to stick it to the Pharisees. I don't think that's the only reason. There's something about pushing pause for 24 hours that invites us to be even more connected with God and more eyes open to the people around us, to see what God's doing, where we're going, and to see what people are needing in our path and the places those two things intersect. It's not just you that needs to embrace this idea. We need you to rest, and your neighborhood needs you to rest too. See, when it comes to the two most important things to Jesus, remember what he said? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. The simplest step to obedience for those things might just be found in the command that carries the least weight. The Sabbath, Jesus says, was made for man. Look at the rest of his sentence. Verse 27. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. See, this is where religion gets it wonky. Understand what Jesus is saying. He's saying the Sabbath is not an entity that has to be appeased. It's not some code that has to be satisfied in order to make God happy with you or keep God happy with you. That was never the design for Sabbath. So when we talk about how to live into this, again, don't think of it in terms of keeping the rules. Think of it in terms of enjoying a gift. So if that's true, why did God even put it in the rules to begin with? Well, check this out. I think because he knew the excuses that people like us would make. He knew that both in the sense of scarcity, I don't have enough, and in the presence of abundance, look at all I've got, we would use both of them as excuses to avoid the gift that he wants to give us. Come on, isn't that true? Some of us live in the sense of scarcity. I don't have enough. I'm not going to have enough. Isn't that an excuse for not resting? I can't rest. I got bills to pay. I got work to do. I got things to go. Presence of scarcity in our life. Rest is a luxury for the rich. I can't afford to take a day off. I got to make ends meet. Scarcity causes us to ignore the gift, but it's also the presence of abundance that does it too, isn't it? I can't take a day off. I got so much house to clean. I got so much yard to mow. I got so many bills to pay. I got so many mouths to feed. I can't rest. I got so much stuff. Now think about this. You realize God gave the 10 Commandments twice to the nation of Israel? First time he gave them was in Exodus chapter 20. If you remember the scene, he gave this to a group of people who were all runaway slaves, who were wandering around in the wilderness, sensing scarcity, eating bread out of the dirt, off the ground, moving from place to place because they were constantly afraid they were going to run out of water. You know the other time that he gives it? Deuteronomy chapter 5, right before the nation walks into the land of abundance, the land that God had promised, because he knew what some of us have learned. Abundance is not the secret to rest. So where is rest found? Well, look at Jesus' last sentence, Mark chapter 2, verse 28. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. You understand what Jesus is saying? He's saying Sabbath points to him, and it's made possible in him. He's saying really simply, when you find your life in me, you don't have to find your identity in your work anymore. As important as work is, you don't have to find your value in work anymore. You don't find your status through what you do and what you accomplish and what people say. So you're free to walk away from it for 24 hours every week. I'm the reason you can do it. And I can give you the power to walk through it. Even if you don't think you can. If Jesus is your Lord, you can. Here's what I want to do. I want to challenge you to try it for 2 months. Would you just experiment with it for the next 2 months? Give it a shot. Or maybe experiment with it again if you've tried it in the past. Okay? Let me give you just a couple of principles that I think you draw out from all of these different scriptures here. Okay, not procedure. Remember, I'm not giving you procedure. Procedure is what the Pharisees came up with, all of the rules and the restrictions and the things that took something that was designed to be a joy and a delight and turned it into a curse. Don't do that. Okay, if you find yourself thinking through the grid of, okay, it's Sabbath, what am I not allowed to do? You're thinking through the wrong grid. It was made for you. Starting in the wrong spot. This isn't designed to be a day that you're not allowed to miss. It's designed to be the kind of day that you wouldn't want to miss. In fact, a kind of day that you'd be so keyed on that you'd spend your whole week anticipating it, preparing for it, looking forward to it, sort of like Christmas morning every single week. You commit to it, you plan on it, you prepare for it, you block it off so that you're free to enjoy it to the fullest. In fact, one of the things I'm experimenting with a little bit these days, the Jewish day started at sundown. So Sabbath for the Jewish people starts on Friday night when the sun goes down. They celebrate it all the way until sundown on Saturday. There's something beautiful about that. So if you go, for example, on Saturday night, sundown, to Sunday night, sundown, Sunday's your Sabbath, that'll work for a whole bunch of you, maybe not all of you. Romans chapter 14 says that to make somebody else's day be your day or the day is wrong. So don't do that. Pick a day. Find a day. Celebrate it. Sunday makes the most sense for a whole lot of us. What it gives me when I start at sundown and go to sundown is it gives me the chance to prepare, to think through it, to be ready to get stuff accomplished, to be prepared to really lean into this. And prepared for it so that you can live into it, live through it, and enjoy it, rejoice through it. So what does it look like? Let me just give you a couple of principles here. 5 words. Process everything through to decide whether or not you do it on a Sabbath or you just try to save it for the rest of the week. Okay? First word is rest. Rest. Remember Shabbat and Nuach. Resting from work. Settling in. Okay, if it's not one of those two, or if it's the opposite of one of those two, you're free to do it the 6 other days. You're free to skip it that day. Free to tell it no. That includes the work that you get paid for and the work that you don't get paid for. You realize you get a lot of work that you don't get paid for, that you feel like you have to do to maintain the abundance, the luxuries that God's given you. You're free to rest from that. So for me, some of those things are obvious in my world. Like I turn off my email. I don't read books that are connected to sermons that I'm planning. I refuse to go into the office. I don't schedule meetings. I want to rest. I want to settle in. I don't pay bills. I don't clean. Sit by the fire? Yes. Take a nap? Yes. Watch a movie? Sure. And one other thing, Carrie and I are talking about doing this more and more together with our kids now that they're older. One of the decisions we made really early on, because it was impossible for both of us with young kids to do this at the same time, was just help each other out. We would alternate days. She would do it one day, I would do it another day, just because of the season of our life. And yet now we're at a season of our life where we want to do this together, celebrate with our kids, so that they learn to love the fact that God says, hey, take a day off. You may be in either season. Again, you're free. It's not procedure. It's privilege. It's a gift. Do what you have to do to rest. That's the first word. Second word is resist. Resist. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, when Moses gives this 10 commandments for the second time, he makes it explicit. He says, remember the Sabbath day every single week to celebrate and to declare that Pharaoh is not your God anymore. He wasn't ever your God, but you had to live like he was your God. Remember Pharaoh? Pharaoh, whose constant mantra for the people was work harder, work faster. You're only as good today as you were yesterday, or the guy next to you was yesterday. Like margin in your life is evidence that you're either inept or lazy. That's the voice of Pharaoh. Get back to work. God explicitly says you're free from him, so resist his voice. For a bunch of us, social media exemplifies the voice of Pharaoh, doesn't it? Like you're not enough. You're falling behind. You got to keep up. You got to catch up. Your life needs to look like his or hers. One of the most freeing things you might be able to do to just resist the voice of Pharaoh in your life is turn off the social media for 24 hours a day. I'm done. Pharaoh's not my God. Free to rest. Third thing, Sabbath is supposed to be a chance to reconnect. To reconnect. You notice in the Bible, if you look through all of the Sabbath passages, it's almost always called a Sabbath to the Lord. Or Sabbath towards God, which doesn't mean we're supposed to live away from God the other 6 days, and then on the seventh day we go, oh, yeah, hey, wow, you're here. Like the idea of the Bible is that all of the days are toward God, but the Sabbath in a unique way give us a privilege to think back on why we're allowed to live connected with God every single day of the week. So part of what I love to do on a day like this is find something new that allows me to express my connection with God in a way I don't get to the rest of the week. That's why for a bunch of us, Sunday is the best day for us. It's gathering together, chance for us to express that in a really unique way that we don't get to the rest of the week. We do silence, we do solitude, we talked about that last week. We connect with God all throughout the rest of the week, but when all of us come together, all of that comes together and it's unique. For some of us, there's more we could do that we'd love to do, that we'd want to do. It's a cup of coffee in the morning, an extended time of prayer, reading the scriptures, a long walk, or a hike, on a nice day, some time in nature, to just connect with God in a way that we don't get to the rest of the week. Maybe a long walk through your neighborhood. Pray with your eyes open for what God might be doing right where you're at. That sets you up to the next thing, reflect. Not just reflect on, but reflect out. Remember Jesus' example? Allowing Jesus to live his life in you and through you is not work. Loving your neighbor doesn't bear weight. It can be the fullest expression of rest and an exhilarating delight. It can fill your life and your heart with joy. But keep your eyes open as you're connecting with God to places that he's at work in the world. At a different pace allows your eyes to see. Keep your eyes open for people to serve. Have your neighbors over to feast. Find a place around here on a Sunday morning, expression, reflection of who he is, what he's doing in you, reflects through you. Not as a task. It's a chance to allow him to live his life in us and through us and bounce his light off of us wherever we go. Reflect. And as all of that's happening, it's hard not to rejoice. That's the last word, rejoice. See, here's the thing about Sabbath. When you look through the Bible, It's more than just a day to push pause. It's part of what Jesus said when he says the Sabbath, the Lord is the Lord of the Sabbath. Book of Hebrews, Sabbath is a metaphor for heaven. Moment where we experienced in full the world that we long for but aren't ever quite able to arrive at here. Sabbath's a gift from God that lets us every single week enjoy an appetizer of a great feast to come. So feast. Blow your diet. I know a couple that just taken that idea literally. They went and they go get wedding cake every single week to enjoy just a slice of on Sabbath because they want to anticipate and rejoice in a wedding feast that they know is coming. Maybe that's not your thing. What's your thing? Do something that you'll look forward to all week, that you allow yourself to enjoy on that day. Don't make it a task. Don't make it an obligation. Don't make it an obligation or a task for yourself or your kids. See it as an opportunity to celebrate, to rejoice, to remember, to reflect, to rest. And a day you look forward to more than any other day on the calendar. It's an invitation to you from God, not a rule you have to keep, but a path you're free to walk. Because your God is the God who invites you to rest. And I promise you, if you stick to it, you practice it, you'll get good at it. And it'll become the greatest blessing of your life you've ever had to force yourself to enjoy. Henry Ward Beecher said it this way: a world without Sabbath would be like a man without a smile, like a summer without flowers, like a homestead without a garden. It's the very best day of the week. If God makes that possible and he invites you to enjoy it, why wouldn't you want to get in on that? Would you pray with me? Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And it's possible this morning that you don't know him personally, so all of this seems hard. The whole idea of rest points to Jesus, and it comes from him. It points towards a Jesus that we're free to rest in because he came and fulfilled the requirements on our behalf. And he took the curse of a cross on our behalf. And he's willing to trade records with us as a gift. It costs us absolutely nothing. And if this morning you've never received that gift, or you're not sure you can receive it right where you sit, it's as simple as just telling him in your own words, Jesus, I need life. I'm anxious, I'm afraid, I'm lonely, I'm tired. And you told us if we would come to you when we're weary and heavy laden, you would give us rest. Jesus, I need eternal rest, and I'm receiving it now. Father, I pray for the person that's receiving that gift in this moment. Pray that you would, Lord, just fill their hearts with such joy and hope that comes from you, that invites their soul even in this moment to find a place of rest in you. Lord, I pray for those of us who received that gift a long time ago and have gotten back to the hustle. We've forgotten to rest. What a gift that the command isn't get the Sabbath right. It's remember the Sabbath. And Lord, we've forgotten. So would you let us remember? Not a list of rules, not a regulation, but the hope, the privilege, the gift it is to find our rest in you. Would you let us be people who pause, who stop, who celebrate, who rejoice, reflect you? Or will you let us be people that live life that's really life because you made it possible and our whole life can point to you? Would you let that be the story of our soul? In Jesus' name we ask it. Amen.